The morning I found $3 million sitting in an account I never knew existed, my husband was standing in our kitchen making pancakes in the same faded gray t-shirt he'd worn for 6 years, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that I no longer knew the man I had married. If this story touched something in you before it has even truly begun, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. Stories like this one remind us that love is often tested in the quietest, most unexpected moments, and our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe in redemption rather than give up on people. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 11 years I was married to a man named Thomas Whitfield, a quiet, steady, unremarkable accountant who worked for a mid-sized logistics company in a gray office building on the edge of town. When people met Thomas, they often forgot him within minutes. He wasn't loud. He didn't fill a room. He wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation through winter, drove a 12-year-old Honda with a dent in the rear bumper he never bothered to fix, and packed his lunch in a scratched plastic container every single morning before the sun came up. I loved him for exactly these reasons. In a world that seemed to reward noise and spectacle, Thomas was a still, quiet harbor, and I had built my entire sense of safety around his predictability. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Larkspur Lane, the kind of house with a crooked mailbox and a garden that never quite flourished no matter how much I fussed over it. We had 2 children, a boy named Oliver who was 9 and obsessed with dinosaurs, and a girl named Josephine, called Josie by everyone who loved her, who was 6 and never stopped asking questions about everything under the sun. Our life was not extraordinary. We counted coupons on Sunday afternoons. We argued gently about whether we could afford new tires for the car. We celebrated birthdays with grocery store cake because the bakery downtown charged too much for buttercream. I taught piano lessons to neighborhood children in our living room to help make ends meet, and some months, after paying the mortgage and the utilities and Oliver's asthma medication, there was almost nothing left over. I never resented this life. I had grown up in a chaotic household with a father who drank away half our income, and the steadiness Thomas offered felt, to me, like a kind of miracle. That is why, on the Tuesday morning in early spring when I opened our shared banking app to pay the electric bill and found a linked account I did not recognize, containing a number so large I had to sit down on the edge of our bed and read it 4 times, my hands actually began to shake. $3,240,000. Not $3,200. Not $32,000. $3 million. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, certain it was some kind of banking error, a glitch, a stolen identity, anything except what it actually was. I found Thomas in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with the same chipped spatula we'd owned since our wedding registry, humming some tune under his breath the way he always did on weekend mornings. Oliver was at the table drawing a Tyrannosaurus Rex with crayons, and Josie was trying to convince the dog that pancakes were, in fact, a breakfast food appropriate for canines. It was such an ordinary scene, so achingly familiar, that for a moment I almost didn't say anything at all. But my hands were still trembling, and I held up my phone and asked him, as steadily as I could manage, what this account was. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Something passed behind his eyes, something I had never seen there in 11 years of marriage, a kind of calculation, quick and sharp, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Then he set down the spatula, turned off the stove, and asked the children to go watch cartoons in the other room. Oliver protested about his unfinished pancake. Josie asked if she could bring the dog. Thomas said yes to both, gently, patiently, the way he always spoke to our children, and once they had scampered off with the dog trotting behind them, he turned to me with an expression I could not read, and he said, quietly, that we needed to talk. What followed was one of the strangest conversations of my life, delivered entirely in Thomas's calm, measured, unhurried voice, as though he were explaining a mildly complicated tax form rather than the fact that he had secretly become a billionaire. He told me that 4 years earlier, almost on a whim, he had invested a small inheritance from his late uncle, an eccentric man named Walter who had lived alone in Vermont and left Thomas $11,000 when he passed. Instead of using it to fix the leaking roof as I had believed at the time, Thomas had quietly invested it in a small technology company run by a college friend, a company that built software for supply chain logistics, the exact field Thomas understood better than almost anyone I'd ever met. The company had grown. Then it had grown explosively. Then, 18 months ago, it had been acquired by a much larger corporation in a deal that made Thomas, on paper, worth just over $1.1 billion. I remember staring at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was some elaborate joke, some prank he and his brother had cooked up. But Thomas did not laugh. He simply sat there at our worn kitchen table, in his 6-year-old t-shirt, in the house with the crooked mailbox, and he told me the truth as plainly as if he were reading a grocery list. He had known for 18 months. He had said nothing. Not one word, not one hint, not one moment where the mask had slipped, not once in 500 and some odd days of us sitting across from each other at dinner, of us falling asleep next to each other, of us worrying together about whether we could afford new tires. I asked him, my voice cracking in a way that embarrassed me, why? Why would he hide something so enormous from me, his wife, the mother of his children, the person who had built her entire life around trusting him completely? And this is the part of the story that I think about most, the part that still makes my chest tighten even now as I tell it to you. Thomas told me that he needed to know something before he could tell me the truth. He needed to know whether I loved him, Thomas, the ordinary man with the dented Honda and the chipped spatula, or whether some small, unacknowledged part of me had married the version of him that could have been more, could have offered more, could have given me and our children an easier, richer life. He said he had watched, quietly, for 18 months, whether I complained about our modest circumstances, whether I resented the coupon clipping and the store-brand cereal and the years without a real vacation, whether, deep down, some part of me wished he were a different kind of man. I want to tell you honestly that in that moment, sitting in our kitchen with pancake batter still cooling on the counter and our children's cartoon laughter drifting faintly from the other room, I did not feel gratitude for his honesty. I felt something closer to fury, a betrayal so deep and so strange that I did not even have words for it yet. I had spent 18 months being tested, silently, without my knowledge or consent, by the man I trusted more than anyone on earth. Every grocery store trip, every night I stayed up late trying to figure out how to stretch our budget through the last week of the month, every small sacrifice I had made without complaint because I loved him and believed we were building something together, all of it had secretly been a kind of examination, and I had not even known I was taking a test. I stood up from the table so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor, and I walked out onto the back porch because I needed air, because the walls of that familiar kitchen suddenly felt like they were closing in on me. Thomas did not follow immediately. He gave me space, which was, I suppose, its own kind of message, that even now he was still watching, still calculating, still waiting to see what I would do. I stood on that porch for nearly 20 minutes, staring at our sad little garden with its wilting tomato plants, and I thought about every year of our marriage, replaying it now through this new, unbearable lens. Had he been testing me the whole 18 months, or had something shifted only recently? Had there been moments he was secretly laughing at my worry over the electric bill, knowing he could pay off our entire mortgage without noticing the dent in his fortune? When Thomas finally came outside, he did not defend himself right away. He simply stood beside me at the porch railing, close but not touching, and he told me something that, despite everything, cracked something open in my anger. He said that his own father had married a woman who left him within a year of him receiving a modest inheritance, a woman who had claimed to love him deeply until real money entered the picture, at which point she revealed herself to be in love with comfort, not with him. Thomas had been 12 years old when this happened, and he had watched his father, a proud, quiet man, fall into a depression that lasted years, convinced that he was fundamentally unlovable outside of what he could provide. Thomas told me, his voice unsteady for the first time in the entire conversation, that some small, wounded part of him, some scared 12-year-old boy who had never fully healed, had needed to know, with absolute certainty, that I loved him and not the money, before he could risk exposing our marriage to that kind of test. I understood, intellectually, where this fear had come from. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and I told him so, plainly, standing there on that porch in the thin morning light. I told him that even the most wounded, understandable fear does not give a person the right to secretly interrogate the person they claim to love, does not give them the right to withhold something this enormous while watching, silently, coldly, almost scientifically, to see how she would perform under conditions she did not know she was being tested against. I told him that trust was supposed to run in both directions, and that whatever his father's wounds had done to him, he had, in his own way, replicated a version of that same betrayal, just aimed at me instead. We did not resolve anything that first day. I moved into the guest room that night, the first time in 11 years of marriage we had slept under separate roofs of the same house, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the entire architecture of my marriage over in my mind, searching for cracks I might have missed, moments where the truth might have leaked through if I had only been paying closer attention. I thought about small oddities I had dismissed without a second thought, the time 8 months earlier when Thomas had mentioned, almost too casually, that his old college friend Marcus had sold his company, and I had simply nodded and asked if that meant Marcus would finally be able to afford a decent car. I thought about the strange, brief trip Thomas had taken to New York 11 months ago, ostensibly for a work conference, that I now suspected had been something else entirely. Every memory I turned over revealed a hidden second layer I had never suspected existed, and the sensation was disorienting in a way I cannot fully describe, like discovering that the floor of your house has secretly been made of glass the whole time, and only now, cracking beneath your feet, do you realize how precarious your footing always was. The days that followed were among the strangest of my life. Thomas continued going to his job at the logistics company, a detail that struck me as almost absurd given what I now knew, and when I asked him why, if he was worth over $1 billion, he still drove to that gray office building every morning at 7:15, he told me that the job gave him structure and purpose. That money without purpose had nearly destroyed men he had watched from a distance in his new world of investors and executives, and that he did not want to become a stranger to himself in addition to becoming, apparently, a stranger to me. I remember finding this explanation both admirable and, in that raw early stage of my hurt, almost insulting, as though he had access to some deep well of self-awareness and moral discipline that he simply had not extended to include honesty with his own wife. Word did not stay contained for long, not in a town the size of ours. Within 2 weeks, somehow, whispers began to circulate, first among our closest friends, then more widely, that Thomas Whitfield, quiet, unremarkable Thomas from the accounting department, had become fantastically wealthy. I do not know precisely how the news spread, though I suspected it originated with Marcus, Thomas's college friend and business partner, who had never been particularly discreet even under ordinary circumstances. Within a month, our lives had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, and not entirely in ways I welcomed. Relatives I had not heard from in years suddenly began calling with warm, effusive greetings, asking after the children, mentioning, with practiced casualness, various financial difficulties they were experiencing. My own sister, Vanessa, with whom I had a complicated and often distant relationship, drove 3 hours unannounced to sit in our living room and cry about her mounting credit card debt, looking at me with an expression that made it clear she expected, perhaps even felt entitled to, some portion of what she now understood to be our new reality. Old friends from high school reappeared on social media with sudden, renewed interest in reconnecting. Even people from our church, people I had trusted and confided in for years, began treating me differently, with a strange mixture of warmth and calculation that made my skin crawl. Amid all of this external chaos, my anger toward Thomas slowly, gradually, began to shift into something more complicated. I watched him navigate this sudden onslaught of attention with the same quiet steadiness that had always defined him, gently declining requests for money from distant relatives, politely redirecting reporters who somehow got hold of our home phone number, protecting our children fiercely from any exposure to the strange new gravity our family now exerted on the people around us. I began to understand, watching him move through this storm, that perhaps his instinct towards secrecy had not been entirely about testing me, that perhaps some significant part of it had also been about protecting the fragile, ordinary life we had built together for as long as possible, a life he clearly understood, better than I initially gave him credit for, was about to be irrevocably altered. Still, understanding his fears did not erase the wound of having been secretly evaluated for 18 months without my knowledge, and I told him this again and again during the long, difficult conversations we began having each evening after the children had gone to bed, conversations that sometimes ended in tears, sometimes in silence, and once, memorably, in Thomas breaking down completely at our kitchen table, sobbing in a way I had genuinely never witnessed in 11 years of marriage. Apologizing not with excuses but with a raw, unguarded honesty that finally, slowly, began to soften something in me. He told me, that particular evening, about nights during those 18 months when the guilt of his secrecy had kept him awake long after I had fallen asleep beside him, when he had lain in the dark listening to my breathing, hating himself for the deception even as his fear kept him locked into it. He told me about the moment, several months earlier, when I had come home exhausted from a long day of piano lessons, having turned down a paying student because the family could not afford my rate and I simply hadn't had the heart to insist, and how he had watched me make that small, quiet sacrifice for a stranger's child while knowing, with a kind of unbearable guilt, that he could have solved every financial worry in our household with a single phone call to his accountant. He told me that watching me continue to be generous, patient, and unresentful throughout months of financial strain that he alone knew was entirely unnecessary had been, in his words, one of the most painful experiences of his life, because it proved to him exactly what he had needed to know, that I loved him and not his circumstances, while simultaneously making him despise the test he had constructed, a test that required my continued, unknowing suffering in order to produce its answer. This confession did something important in me. It did not erase my hurt, but it humanized it, transformed it from a cold, calculated betrayal into the desperate, flawed choice of a wounded man trying, in the only way his broken understanding of love had taught him, to protect himself from a repetition of his father's devastation. I told Thomas, that night, that I forgave the fear that had motivated his secrecy, even as I still needed him to understand the depth of harm his method had caused, that love cannot be built on unilateral tests any more than a house can be built on sand, and that if we were going to move forward together, truly together, it would require a new kind of honesty between us. One built not on grand gestures or secret evaluations but on the daily, unglamorous practice of simply telling each other the truth. We did not fix everything in one conversation, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think stories that promise instant, perfect healing do a disservice to anyone who has actually lived through a genuine betrayal. There were setbacks in the weeks that followed. There were nights I lay awake in the guest room, unable to fully release my anger, turning it over and over like a stone in my palm. There was a particularly difficult afternoon when Oliver, now aware in the vague way that children sense tension even when they don't understand its source, asked me if Mom and Dad were going to get a divorce, a question that broke something open in my chest and forced me to confront how much our unresolved conflict was already touching our children, whether we intended it to or not. It was that question from Oliver, more than anything Thomas said or did, that pushed me toward a genuine reckoning with what I actually wanted. I spent an entire day walking alone through the small park near our house, the same park where Thomas and I had had our first real conversation 11 years earlier, back when he was a shy, awkward young accountant and I was a piano teacher barely making rent, both of us equally unremarkable, equally uncertain about our futures, equally drawn to something quiet and true in each other that had nothing to do with money or circumstance. I thought about the 11 years since, the children we had built together, the small rituals and inside jokes and shared history that constituted the real architecture of our marriage, far more substantial, I realized, than any single act of secrecy, however painful. I came home that evening and told Thomas that I was willing to work toward rebuilding our trust, but that I needed something from him beyond apology. I needed him to understand, concretely and permanently, that our marriage could not survive another unilateral test, another secret evaluation conducted without my knowledge or consent. I needed him to commit, not just in words but in the daily texture of our life together, to a partnership built on mutual transparency, where major decisions, however uncomfortable, were made together rather than unilaterally imposed. Thomas agreed, and more importantly, in the months that followed, he demonstrated this commitment through consistent, patient, unglamorous action rather than empty promises. We made the decision together, deliberately and slowly, about how to integrate this new reality into our family's life. We agreed that our children would continue attending their same public school, that we would not suddenly transform our modest house on Larkspur Lane into some ostentatious mansion, that we would move gradually rather than allowing sudden wealth to sever us from the community and values that had shaped us. We did make certain changes, practical and meaningful ones. We paid off our mortgage entirely, a moment that brought me to unexpected tears, remembering all those Sunday afternoons spent worrying over the numbers. We established a fund for Oliver's medical expenses so I would never again feel that particular flavor of parental fear when his asthma flared. We quietly paid off my sister Vanessa's most pressing debts, not as a gesture of vindication but because, once my anger had settled, I recognized her desperation as genuine rather than purely opportunistic, and because compassion, I had come to believe, mattered more than protecting myself from being taken advantage of occasionally. Perhaps the most significant decision we made together was to establish a scholarship fund at the local community center, named quietly after Thomas's uncle Walter, the eccentric Vermont man whose modest inheritance had started this entire unlikely chain of events. The fund provided piano lessons, art classes, and academic tutoring to children from families who, like ours had once been, were doing their best but struggling to afford enrichment beyond the basics. I began overseeing this program myself, and something in me that had felt bruised and uncertain throughout the preceding months began to heal through the simple, grounding work of helping other families the way I once would have desperately wanted to be helped. It was during this period of rebuilding that Thomas and I had perhaps the most important conversation of our entire marriage, one that occurred not in a moment of crisis but on an ordinary Sunday afternoon while we sat together on our back porch watching Oliver and Josie chase the dog through the yard, the same yard where I had stood in shock and fury just months before. Thomas told me that he had come to understand, through watching my reaction and through the difficult work of examining his own fear, that real love cannot be proven through secret tests any more than trust can be built through surveillance. He said that the 18 months of hidden wealth had taught him something he wished he had understood decades earlier, watching his own father's heartbreak, that the antidote to fear of betrayal is not secrecy and evaluation but vulnerability and honest communication, however frightening that honesty might feel in the moment. I told him, in turn, that the experience had taught me something as well, something about the fragility and resilience of trust simultaneously, how it can be shattered in a single conversation and yet, given genuine effort and consistent honesty over time, can also be rebuilt, not into its original form exactly, but into something perhaps even sturdier, tempered by having survived real testing, ironic as that phrase now felt in our particular circumstance. I told him that I did not resent our journey, difficult as it had been, because it had forced both of us to articulate truths about ourselves and our fears that we might otherwise have carried silently for the rest of our marriage, truths that, once spoken aloud, no longer held quite the same power to quietly poison the relationship from within. Now, before I share how our story continues to unfold, I want to pause and ask you something, because I believe the heart of this story lives in a question each of us has probably faced in some form. If you have ever had to rebuild trust with someone you loved after discovering a painful truth, or if you have ever had to find the courage to be honest about a fear that made you act in ways you later regretted, I would love for you to share that experience in the comments below. Your stories are often the most meaningful part of this journey we share together, and I read every single one, because I believe our community grows wiser and kinder through the honest sharing of our struggles and our healing. In the 2 years since that fateful Tuesday morning when I discovered the account that changed everything, our life has settled into a new, hard-won rhythm, one that honors both where we came from and where circumstance has unexpectedly carried us. Thomas eventually left his position at the logistics company, not because the wealth made the job unnecessary, but because he found a more meaningful use of his time and expertise advising small logistics startups founded by people who reminded him, he says, of his younger self and his old friend Marcus, people with good ideas and not enough capital to see them through. Our house on Larkspur Lane still has its crooked mailbox, which we have never bothered to fix, partly out of nostalgia and partly, I think, as a quiet reminder to both of us of the ordinary, imperfect foundation our extraordinary story was built upon. Oliver, now 11, has become passionately devoted to paleontology in a way that has only intensified since our scholarship fund allowed us to take him to natural history museums across the country, trips we could never have afforded in our old life, and watching his eyes light up in front of dinosaur skeletons remains, for me, one of the purest joys of whatever financial security this strange chapter has brought us. Josie, now 8, has become something of a fierce advocate for the children in our scholarship program, often insisting on tagging along to piano lessons and art classes, declaring with the confident authority of an 8-year-old that everyone deserves to learn beautiful things regardless of how much money their family has. My relationship with Thomas, while forever marked by the strange test he once secretly administered, has grown into something I believe is genuinely stronger than what came before, not because the wealth solved our problems, but because surviving the betrayal and doing the difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust taught us both how to communicate with a level of honesty that our earlier, more comfortable years together had never actually required. We still disagree, still argue occasionally about decisions large and small, but we no longer keep significant truths from each other, an agreement we renew, in small ways, almost every single day. I think often about that morning in the kitchen, pancake batter cooling on the counter, my hands shaking as I stared at a number I could not comprehend, and I recognize now that the true test of our marriage was never really about the money at all. The real test came afterward, in how we chose to handle the devastating discovery of a secret kept, in whether we could find our way back to honesty after such a profound rupture, in whether love, real love, could survive not the presence of wealth but the presence of deception, however well-intentioned its origins. I believe, with everything in me, that it can, that people can hurt each other from a place of genuine fear and still find their way back to something true and lasting, if both partners are willing to do the hard, humbling work that healing requires. Before I close this story, I want to ask you directly, because I believe your reflection matters as much as mine, what does trust mean to you, and have you ever had to rebuild it after it was broken by someone you loved? Please leave a meaningful comment below sharing your thoughts, because I believe these conversations, the ones where we are honest about our struggles and our healing, are exactly what our community was built for. If this story touched your heart even a little, I would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a comment sharing your own experience with trust and forgiveness, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Stories like Claire and Thomas's remind us that even the most painful betrayals do not have to be the end of love, that with honesty, humility, and genuine effort, broken trust can be rebuilt into something even more resilient than before. Our family's crooked mailbox still stands on Larkspur Lane, a small, stubborn reminder that the most extraordinary love stories are often built not on grand gestures or hidden fortunes, but on the quiet, daily choice to keep showing up for each other, honestly, imperfectly, and completely, no matter what secrets or storms life brings our way. Thank you for walking through this journey with me today, and I look forward to sharing more stories of kindness, forgiveness, and hope with all of you very soon.